This session is about forest landscape restoration, where all of the papers will focus on aspects of community engagement and involvement in forest landscape restoration. I don't intend to spend any time introducing it. The one thing I should say is that the time is tight, so I'm going to try and be fairly strict on it, John. The first speaker is John Herbohn, who is Professor at the University of Sunshine Coast, and he's also head of the Tropical Forest and Research and People Research Centre at USC. John?
Thanks, Bob. I thought that I would, if I can just start with a video which will place a lot of the things that I'm saying in context. So it's always nice to have some sort of biophysical or geographical, social context where people have got a little bit of a shared understanding. So I'll just play this video. It only goes for 4 minutes. It's a little bit promotional in places, but but it does get across a lot of the messages I want to talk about.
All over the world, there are areas where forests have been cleared and land has been degraded and is no longer producing what people need. This project is an example of how a local community can band together and work with scientists to develop a restoration program that serves many purposes.
Planting trees is much more than simply trying to re-establish forest. Trees provide many benefits, both in financial terms and in creating sustainable livelihoods. Reforestation provides critical environmental benefits such as improved water quality, reduction in soil loss and improved biodiversity.
Internationally speaking, there is this big debate as to whether to plant trees or not, because supposedly these trees would take too much water, thereby reducing stream flow or possibly even drying up your streams. Over the past 4 years, we've been studying the hydrology of community-managed reforestation in the island of Leyte, Philippines. Our prime result is that the reforestation led to improved stream flow regime, such that there was flow all year round instead of seasonal flows prior to reforestation.
In this particular site, we're looking at a trial of 20 different species that are planted in 50 plots. This experiment will tell us a lot about which trees interact well and are ideal for planting in combination on rehabilitation sites.
The hill behind me here is the site of our pilot community-based reforestation project. One of the successes of the program in Biliran is the ability of the People's Organization to produce high-quality seedlings with low mortality rate.
The success I have seen in this project here in Biliran is that the skills of the people have improved, particularly in the proper planting due to the training done by the ACIAR.
Now, at the present, we have also planting agro crops, which is sweet potato, banana, cassava, pineapple, rambutan, jackfruit, lanzones, and gayubano.
The policies that we've advocated have now been put in place and drive the accreditation of nurseries within the Philippines and also the selection of mother trees for reforestation efforts nationwide. Our work has also helped the Philippine government improve the implementation of the National Greening Program, which will reforest 7 million hectares over the next 12 years.
There's been some real successes in Biliran, which now provide an evidence base, not only in and of itself that's produced a lot of academic outputs, but also a really great site where many of the national partners can go and visit and showcase the work that is done and the things that are possible in other locations in the country.
ACIAR researchers, in coordination with government researchers, particularly DNR researchers, translated these research outputs into a policy. The learning from that action research project is really very important in refining our national greening program.
Our project has been successful in many senses. From a scientific perspective, we've undertaken world-class research that will inform reforestation efforts not only in the Philippines but elsewhere in the tropics. In addition, we've been very successful in building the capacity of local Filipino researchers so they can undertake similar work in the future.
Okay, so that video is really just giving a little bit of context to some of the things I'll talk about in the rest of the presentation. So I'll talk a little bit about the project itself, some of the lessons that we've learned from it, and then morph that into a discussion about, you know, the importance of the social landscape and power relationships, and I suppose finish with some comments about, you know, the need to build community capacity as part of any restoration or reforestation project that involves communities, and that all communities aren't the same. That you can't simply treat one community as being identical to another community, both in terms of the general context and also in terms of capacity. So various publications were published widely on this work, mainly in, I suppose, social journals and policy journals, and anyone that is interested in any of those, I'm happy to provide copies. So just some lessons from our pilot reforestation project in the Philippines. This was in an area in the uplands in Cagayan, in the Biliran province at central Visayas. The area that we worked on was grassland, low fertility, very rugged, very steep slopes, and, you know, wind-affected ridges. The community was very poor. It's one of the, you know, the poorest category of communities within the Philippines. The swidden or slash and burn agriculture is the major source of income and food. It had been reforested 4 times over the past 20-odd years through various World Bank and ADB and other national reforestation programs. Fire was a regular occurrence, decimated all the trees that had been previously planted, and the People's Organisation, which was responsible for managing those trees, was dysfunctional and really had a, you know, I suppose, less desirable experience from previous reforestation projects. This is just a map of the general area. So just to illustrate a couple of things, there's a combination of protection and production restoration. So we mapped this with the community. Nestor's in the audience and did the vast majority of this work. We had a good team of people, of local collaborators, and we spent a long time working with the community. You'll note that one thing, however, there's a gap in the middle, that it wasn't a contiguous area. The reason for that is that when we looked at the social landscape, these areas in the middle were just too complex to deal with. The issues were just too complex. They involved various adverse claimants over the land, and if we knew that if we planted trees there, they'd simply be burnt. So there's just no point planting that. So this is one of the first times that we really recognised the importance of the social landscape and the fact that there are some parts of the landscape you just simply can't plant trees on and expect them to stay there unless you pour a lot of money into sorting out that conflict. We learned a lot of lessons from this. You know, we'd spent, I think, 15 years or almost 15 years working in the Philippines prior to this, done a lot of what I think was pretty good research, but ultimately we came down and we hadn't influenced national policy to a large extent, except for, you know, the nursery work that Nestor had done. And so we decided, well, it's about time that we actually put our money, or ACIAR's money, where our thoughts were, and so we designed and implemented this restoration or reforestation program. We learnt a lot of things out of it, and these are just, yes, I suppose 11 of the main lessons, but just to focus on a couple, and Nestor will talk about these a little bit later on in his presentation in more detail. The first is that there needs to be appropriate project design, and that just doesn't include the biophysical components of the landscape. It's really about recognising the social landscape, and importantly, there's a lot of social preparation that's required. Here, we spent a year before we even planted a tree, and that was to build capacity, it was to understand the social dynamics, it was to work with the community, and all of those things. And that, I think, has led to, you know, the success of the, you know, the pilot project. There's various other things there, but I won't go into any detail on those. I'll just talk very briefly about the social, some of the community dynamics which are integral to the social landscape. Jack Baines a few years ago did a review of the literature and identified effectively 5 key elements that impact on the success of community forestry groups, which is the main way of implementing this type of restoration. So he identified these, but more importantly, identified that there's a whole range of complex interactions with those factors, that they're not standalone factors. You just simply can't address one and expect it, that to be the end of it. That, you need to look at the system as a whole, and community forestry group success is a very complex thing to try and to improve. One of the elements here, just to highlight, it's not on, that's why. Okay, is that, this idea of bonding and bridging capital, social capital, that bonding capital is, the ability of the community to work together effectively, and the bridging capital is the ability of the community to work with outside parties. And building that social capital is a very important part of restoration and reforestation projects within the tropics. Power relationships is something that we looked at a lot because it's an integral part of the social landscape, how people interact, how different groups within the community interact. And a couple of things that came out here is that, obviously unbalanced power relationships where you've got very powerful groups on one hand and people that are disempowered on another is an absolute recipe for a project to fail. So when you've got poor landless people with little land, poor land tenure or no land tenure, as opposed to wealthy landholder groups or the elite within society, those types of power relationships really need to be addressed. One of the other things that we looked at was group and collective. We used applied group and collective action theory to look at community forestry within a social landscape. And here, one of the things that we really identified was that capacity building is integral to success. And this will then lead into the final points that I want to make. Strong leadership is important, and typically small group size is better than a large group size because of that social cohesion. One of the points from this slide here is that I want to make that is that extensive investment in bridging social capital and also bonding social capital is really an important component of taking a landscape scale approach to restoration. Now, just very briefly, I want to introduce a concept that we've been throwing around in our group about the importance of the capacity of communities or smallholders to implement forest and landscape restoration or rehabilitation or whatever tree planting activity you want, using effectively the DFID various capitals, as a way of looking at community capital, but we can use whatever metric. Yep. And looking at comparing the level of capacity of communities with the likelihood of project success. And you could argue that there's a linear relationship. As capacity increases, the likelihood of a project also increases. I think it's more like an S-shaped curve where you've got effectively, at low levels of capital, very little success, fairly steep curve as you build capacity, and then it tails off. we've started calling this the community capacity restoration curve. And really, if we look at the Billy Rand example, before we built capacity within community, that community sat right at the bottom of the curve. We spent a lot of effort building capacity within the community. And then we've found that hopefully we've spent more effort to continually building capacity to a point where we hope that there's an inflection point where the community capacity is self-sustaining. Now, without ongoing support, we strongly suspect that that community would fall back down. And so all the good work that we've done will simply be undone. So the trees that we've planted will disappear in 1 or 2 years' time. Finally, just a point on what the implications are more broadly. Well, we think that communities that sit right down in this lower part of the curve are the ones that are most interested in short-term cash-based incomes and food security. So those elements have to be part of any restoration or rehabilitation program. As you move up the curve, the community sitting in the middle part, probably looking for longer-term livelihood things, so longer-term woodlots, longer-term livelihood enhancement is important. And then when you get right up the top, where communities already have a high degree of capacity, these are the communities that are most suited to implementing projects that involve ecosystem goods and services, biodiversity, those types of projects. And if you want to implement those projects, then, and your community sits down here, then you've got to spend a lot of money if you want to be successful building community capacity as part of any project. So they're just a summary of our evolving ideas, and that's, I'll leave it there. But really, I think the key point is we need to better articulate how we define and operationalise social landscapes in our work in both PNG and the Philippines. Really our cases show that the first step is to identify the sites in the social landscape which are amenable to collective action, and if they're not, then you're probably best off just walking away from them. Groups with small membership and strong leadership support collective action are the most effective, and within a geographic landscape, the land where functioning groups control, the land which these groups control is probably or possibly the only land on which reforestation will occur, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, John. What we'll do is leave any questions until the end, so we'll move straight to the next presentation. It's that one. So the next presentation is from Danilo Ignacio de Urzedo, who is a PhD student from the University of Sydney, and he'll be talking about research in the Amazon. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you for inviting me for the session. So my talk today will be based on a research paper published recently this year named Community-Based Native Seeds Production for Restoration in Brazil. This is a collaborative research between different researchers and practitioners from Brazil. My talk aims to explore 3 seed networks in Brazil, and then based on this experience, I will address some solutions to overcome the native seeds shortage. So firstly, it's important to acknowledge where the demand for native seeds is coming from. International agreements has established the restoration target of 350 million hectares by 2030. And to fulfill these international targets, Brazilian government also established a commitment to restore 12 million hectares by 2030, following also our national legislation. What we are talking about, it's actually from now to the next decade, we're going to need a strong interaction between different stakeholders, and also we're going to need to provide resources, services, and products for restoration. So we are talking actually about a restoration value chain, but we have many issues to operate that. On one hand, we have large-scale restoration projects in Brazil. These projects, it's mainly based on legal approaches, are really top-down systems that focus on technical knowledge, and then it really supports the restoration industry with a really technological idea how to do it. And to provide seeds and seedlings, the system is based on large nurseries, and they are facing many issues to provide seeds and seedlings in high quality. On the other hand, seed collectors and producers have reported that actually there's a shortage because the restoration market is really unstable. It's changing based on the changes in law. At the same time, there are many restrictive regulations for marketing seeds in Brazil with standard protocols to control quality and origin. And then there's no investments to supply seeds. To overcome this lack of native seeds, since 2001 and 2002, Brazilian government supports the creation of seed networks. Seed networks is the idea of to promote community-based native seed production, promoting the interaction between different stakeholders, involving communities, research, NGOs, labs, and investors and business. The idea to build long-term partnership, to provide technical information, and also to support the market systems. I will explore 3 successful case studies in Brazil. First, in the Upper Xingu region, in the Amazon frontier, the Xingu Seeds Network. In this region have faced a huge deforestation process, especially from 1990s to 2000, mainly for livestock and crops and soya crop plantation, resulting in one of the highest deforestation rates in the world. So we can see here the first indigenous land in Brazil, a really important symbol of the indigenous rights in Brazil, Xingu Indigenous Park, surrounding by deforestation. This reality actually starts to impact the quality and the quantity of the water in the region, affecting the indigenous access to important resources. To deal with that, start a social environmental campaign in the region called Iikatu Xingu. It means Save the Good Water of Xingu, where start a governance process, trying to build a negotiation between indigenous communities, stakeholders, landowners, to think about the future of this place. So it start taking place a landscape planning and a system to try to restore these areas, but they didn't have any experience. So it started to search how could it be possible to restore these deforested places. And then the solution was using direct seeding, using machines to restore these areas. But didn't have any seed supply. To use direct seeding, we need huge volumes of native seeds. And then in 2007, was created the Xingu Seed Network, idea to involve the local communities to supply these native seeds. After 10 years of activities, nowadays there are 450 seed collectors from indigenous communities, rural settlements, and extractive reserves, mostly women. And then they have supported the restoration of more than 5,000 hectares in the region, and they produced 175 tons of native seeds. The second project was, it is in the central Brazil, focused on restoration of savanna. The project actually, it's based on the Xingu experience. And it is firstly a research project trying to restore 600 hectares of degraded areas inside the Chapada dos Veadeiros National Park. This is the project which won the donation from the ACIAR conference last year in Brazil. So they were trying to find solutions to restore this area in the savanna vegetation. And then they were trying direct seeding in this area and was successful. They they start to promote seed collectors to work, and nowadays there are 60 seed collectors, and they are responsible to organize a local cooperative. What's really different there, they are using grass and shrub species to restore these areas that it's not common in the Brazilian restoration systems. And finally, the third experience is the Co-op Progeral. It is a cooperative of small farmers in Brazil, in the West Amazon. And this is actually a project for mitigation of a construction of a complex hydroelectric systems. Will be 4 different dams in the Madeira River, one of the biggest river in Brazil. And then the hydroelectric company must buy and conserve the area surrounding the dams to follow the national legislation. And also to achieve the social and the economic aspects, the hydroelectric company has supported the creation of a local cooperative. So the local cooperative will be responsible to restore these areas. There are 3,000 hectares to be restored by 2030. And then in 6 years, 81 small farmers have been engaging in seed production, restoration, and monitoring. And then they produced 1,700 kilos of seeds using direct seedings and planting seedlings as well. So what these 3 experiences have in common? First, it's important to have a really clear market systems. There's no engagement of community if we don't identify a demand for markets. So first, organizations, mostly NGOs and governmental organizations, are responsible to map where is the demand. And based on that, they promote local organization to supply. So we are talking about building trust. And to build trust, it's important to have long-term partnerships. And also all the process, it's based on institutional system. It means there are rules. The networks have really general rules at the same time that the specific communities, they develop also specific agreements to address specific issues in their realities. It's also important to acknowledge the local culture and how different communities is responsible for processing seeds in a different way. There's no standard protocol to produce seeds. We need to acknowledge the local culture and the local relationship with the biodiversity. So we can see seed collectors processing seeds using traditional tools or also applying machines. And then this is a key strategy. Okay. Another challenge is it's pricing native seeds. This is a really complex system, and then we consider the collector's labor, the depreciation of materials and tools, and also there's an administrative fee for the networks. In the final price, doesn't cover the social costs, so training courses, events, it's something apart, funded by projects. This is a collaborative decision-making process, and at the end we have a more accessible prices. If you see for Hymenaea styginocarpa species, the seeds from these networks, each kilo will be from $5 to $7 US, and the standard, the conventional market, it is $25 kilo. So we have also a community system supporting to reduce the costs. Another thing, all of these organizations are supporting innovation technology, applying new techniques and trying to find solutions to reduce costs, to promote more socially inclusive systems, and then better ecological outcomes. Just to finish my talk, we suggest that we need huge investments in research, especially to develop seed technology and new ecological restoration methods. And beyond that, commercialization systems should be based on long-lasting contracts, and the price formulation should be respecting communities' principles. So the national legislation in Brazil should be flexible in terms of the seed testing quality to improve the supply, and also we need to improve the local participation in terms of outside incentives and the local knowledge recognition. So thank you very much. This is, I'm summarizing in 15 minutes the work of hundreds of people, of indigenous communities, set of farmers, and many different organizations. It's really important to acknowledge their work because they believe in restoration as a key strategy to support a society with more inclusion and with environmental justice. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Danilo. I should also add he's not just acknowledging the work of a lot of people from different organisations, but he's talking about a huge area. It's a vast area that's being discussed, both, just moving around from place to place, plus the area needed for restoration. Okay, the next speaker is Liz Ota, who is from, also from Brazil, and she is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Sunshine Coast. And she's going to talk about the Philippines, I think.
Philippines. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Bob, for organizing this session for us. I'm working in this project with Jen, John, and Nestor, but we've been receiving inputs from many other people. It's on leading and lagging indicators for forest restoration. And as Danilo mentioned, and many other people mentioned in this conference, there are very ambitious global goals for forest restoration, including the Bond Challenge, which is aimed at bringing 250 million hectares of degraded lands into restoration by 2030. And the Bond Challenge has contributions from many other more regional initiatives, such as the AFR 100, which aims at restoring 100 million hectares of lands in Africa by 2030, and the Initiative 2020, which aims at bringing 20 million hectares into forest restoration by 2020. And these goals, they are based in Forest and Landscape Restoration Approach, or FLR. Recently, the Global Partnership for Forest and Landscape Restoration published the revised version of the FLR principles, which states that FLR should be focused on a landscape level instead of individual sites, that it should engage stakeholders and support participatory governance, that it should restore multiple social, economic, and ecological benefits, and it should also maintain and enhance natural ecosystems and avoid further degradation. FLI should be tailored to the local context, and finally, it should be managed adaptively. So these are the countries where our Tropical Forest and People Research Center works at different intensities. The dark green ones are the ones where we work more intensively. And some of these countries themselves have their own forest restoration goals. Brazil, for instance, we have the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact, which aims at restoring 15 million hectares of forests by 2050, including 1 million of contribution to the Bond Challenge by 2020. It's aimed at promoting biodiversity conservation, income generation, provision of key ecosystem services, and an incentive for landholders to comply with our forest code. In the Philippines, there is the National Greening Program, which is aimed at reforesting over 7 million hectares by 2028 to promote food production, poverty reduction, adaptation and mitigation of climate change, and biodiversity conservation. So we can see that these initiatives have very broad goals, but how is progress being assessed? So every report on NGP, National Greening Program in the Philippines, their reports of progress are often based on number of trees planted, area planted, seedling survival rate, which they have a threshold of 80%, But is it enough? As here I have two photos of two different forest restoration projects with smallholders. They were both established in the mid-90s by the same, with different smallholders, but with the same assistance from a program, same type of capacity building, roughly same area and same species pool. And we can see that 25 years later, they are in very different stages, even though they would be counted as the same in a report that would only count area, number of seedlings planted, and seedling survival rate. In Brazil, on the other hand, the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact has proposed a protocol for measuring success or progress of the projects under the program, which is much more complex and embraces much other aspects of forest restoration. It includes social aspects, economic aspects, ecological aspects, and also aspects related to the project and program development. However, we spoke to one of the researchers involved in the development of this protocol, and he said it hasn't actually been fully adopted because of its complexity. So our group is currently implementing several forest restoration, landscape restoration projects in the Philippines, and we decided we would come up with our own framework and our own indicators. And because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, we first looked at the existing frameworks, gray literature, scientific publications, monitoring protocols. We looked at several of them and collected all the indicators and came up with a first list of indicators. We did a first screening process and removed the ones that were irrelevant to us in the Philippines. And then in several workshops, which we're still doing the workshops with different groups of stakeholders, we're gonna classify these indicators according to their relevance, ease of measure, and we're also gonna see the metrics we can use. And we're gonna classify them being either a leading indicator, a lagging indicator, or both. Leading indicators point to the likelihood of obtaining a certain outcome, and lagging indicators are the outcomes themselves. And because FLR puts people in the center of the process, we're going to use the DFID Sustainable Livelihood Framework as a basis for our framework, and use the components of this framework as our criteria. So the vulnerabilities to which the stakeholders are exposed, the livelihood assets, so human, natural, physical, financial, and social capitals, and the policies, institutions, and processes that surround their lives. But we're not going to use this structure of framework, which is often used with criteria, indicators, and metrics. We are here considering that criteria and indicators are interconnected, forming a network. We also consider that indicators change across scales and over time. So the scales we are using were proposed by Robin Chesden. The scales are project, program, and process. So an example of an indicator related to natural capital at the process level could be the presence of special life forms, which could be observed in the medium to long term. At the program level, this morning we heard our colleague from New Zealand saying that the political environment had a great impact on the success of his project. So we could say that the political environment, a supportive political environment, could be a leading indicator for further success of the program. At the project level, one example of an indicator related to the natural capital and local institutions that could be both leading or lagging is land tenure status. Depending on the land tenure status, a landholder may be inclined to be engaged in FLR or not. So, and as a lagging indicator, land tenure claims can be strengthened through forest restoration. So we are now carrying out the workshops with different groups of stakeholders. I'll be going to the Philippines in November, and we are hoping to classify our indicators and build paths like this, connecting leading and lagging indicators, and then we want to collect data from forest restoration projects in the Philippines and develop structural equation models to validate these paths so we can see what indicators are actually relevant to, what leading indicator is actually relevant to a lagging indicator. And then we're hoping to come up with a prospectus of indicators that could be used in the Philippines at different levels and hopefully be adopted by other groups carrying out FLI in the Philippines. And how can these indicators be used? They can be used in the design of projects and programs, or selection of communities to engage, or even bringing up communities to a certain level of capacity in order to increase the likelihood of success. We can use the indicators to assess the likelihood of success even at early stages of the process. We can use the indicators to evaluate and manage and to report the outcomes. So this is just a work in progress. I was hoping just to show some of our ideas and hopefully get some feedbacks. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. That was a remarkable achievement in time management. Thank you. The next presentation is by Nestor Gregorio, who is also at the University of Sunshine Coast, where he's a research fellow. And I think his talk will link with a lot of what John was talking about earlier. Okay, Nestor.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Good afternoon. My presentation, as Bob mentioned, is very much related to the early presentation of Professor Herbohn and also the video that was shown earlier. So this is about our research initiative in the Philippines as part of our project that is funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. So the initiative is about promoting sustainable community-based forest restoration. Now let me start by giving a brief background about the reforestation programs in the Philippines. The country has been implementing reforestation programs for many years. The early attempts up to the 1970s were largely industry-driven or industry implemented, in which logging companies were required by the government to implement reforestation programs. In the 1980s, a large-scale community-based contract reforestation program was implemented, wherein the communities or forest communities were tapped by the government to establish reforestation projects, but the ownership of the trees remained with the government. In the 1990s, however, the community-based forest management program was institutionalized after realizing that no reforestation efforts will succeed without providing tenural instruments to communities over the land that they are managing and the trees that they have planted. And currently, the government is implementing the National Greening Program, which is quite an ambitious program. It aims to rehabilitate over 7 million hectares of forest lands from 2011 until 2028. So the NGP uses community-based forest management program as the platform, and it is a forest and landscape restoration initiative that is largely undertaken in government-owned lands. It caters both environmental and socioeconomic objectives by tapping approximately 24 million people that are living inside forest lands. But the implementation of the National Greening Program is fraught with many problems. Okay. One of the challenges is how to balance the production and the conservation functions of the restoration sites. The Philippine government wants to plant trees generally for ecological restoration, but the poor farmers who are largely engaged in the implementation of the NGP want to cut the trees and plant agricultural crops to satisfy their subsistence needs. So with this, we initiated the pilot testing of a community-based forest restoration project that aims to provide ecological benefits and also the socioeconomic benefits on a sustainable manner. So the site is situated in the province called Biliran in the Visayas region of the country. And as presented earlier by Professor Herbohn, it is about 26 hectares of upland, which is characterized of having adverse conditions for the growth of trees, but this is a good representative of sites that are commonly subjected to reforestation in the Philippines. The community is poor, with kaingin or Sweden agriculture as the primary source of food and income. The site was planted with trees several times under past reforestation programs, but the frequent occurrence of fire decimated most of the trees. There is an existing people's organization that implemented reforestation projects or past reforestation projects, but it was disbanded when we, before we started the project. So that is the landscape view of the area that shows the various land uses, including the reforestation sites or restoration sites. There's also a secondary forest that is adjacent to it. There are patches of trees that are remnants of previous reforestation programs, and there's also the communal pasture and coconut plantations. By the way, coconut is ubiquitous in Philippine uplands. So what we did, the project adopted the genuine participatory approach in designing the restoration plan. So a series of meetings, workshops, interviews, consultations were undertaken with various stakeholder groups in order to identify the problems that they've experienced in past reforestation projects and also solicit information about how to address those problems. So those information were used as inputs in developing the restoration plan. And as a result, or one of the results of those consultations was the decision to divide the area into different restoration zones. These are the protection, production, and the agroforestry zones. So the production zone includes those areas with undulating ground but with stable soil, and this has been planted with fast-growing trees of high economic value, a combination of native and exotic, depending on the preference of the farmers and also the suitability of the species to the planting site. And part of the plan is to harvest the trees within this zone. Those areas with steep slopes, prone to landslides, riverbanks, areas adjacent to natural forest, have been regarded as part of the protection zone. And this has been planted with native trees, and there is no harvesting plan for trees planted in this zone. However, there's a plan to establish livelihood projects that will not destroy the existing vegetation within this area. The agroforestry zone, on the other hand, has been planted with trees, fruit trees, and agricultural crops to provide food and income to the community. Through the support of the project, the community organization was able to broaden their sources of high-quality germplasm. They were able to identify phenotypically superior mother trees from the natural forest within the community. They were also able to produce high-quality seedlings using smallholder-based technologies that have been demonstrated as part of the project. And also they were able to adopt best practices or smallholder-based best practices in plantation establishment and post-planting silviculture, including the planting of trees across the slope, using large planting holes in order to facilitate root development and maximize capture of rainwater, proper handling of seedlings from the nursery to the planting site, proper planting, application of appropriate fertilizer in adequate amount, and also establishing fire lines in order to protect the plantation from fire. The community has also identified and implemented a package of livelihood activities that would provide benefit in short, medium, and long terms. Now, these livelihood projects include the planting of agricultural crops to provide food and income while they are managing the trees, nursery seedling enterprise, not to sell seedlings to implementers of other reforestation projects, and that is to provide income in short term, planting of fruit trees to provide food and income in medium term, fuel wood production, and they are also thinking of furniture making to utilize the timber from the trees established in a production zone. So in over 3 years of the project implementation, the project demonstrates substantial success in terms of tree establishment and growth. The trees that have been planted in the production zone have achieved an average height of 6 meters in just over 3 years. The trees that are planted in the protection zone are also growing very well, although the rate of growth is not as fast as the exotic and species that are planted in the production area. The organization has also started producing or harvesting the crops that they planted. And one very interesting result is that the site has not been burned since the plantation was established about 3 years ago, almost 4 years now. So from this research, we learned some lessons that we believe are crucial in promoting the success of community-based forest restoration. We found that participatory approach is essential or is very important in designing restoration plans. We found that participatory planning and decision-making is essential in coming up with appropriate project design. And for a project or forest restoration project design to become effective, it should match the needs and interests of the community and should be designed in a holistic manner, to consider all the elements of the complex community-based forest restoration system. And also it should be research-based and should integrate lessons from past reforestation activities in order not to commit the same mistakes that were experienced in past reforestation programs. There must be adequate social preparation. It's very important that the communities should understand the details of the project, not just promise them about the blue skies, the benefits, but also inform them the realities and also the peculiarity of restoration program, that it requires many years for them to manage the trees before they can realize the returns of their investment. There should also be appropriate community organizing in order to promote cohesiveness of the members of the people's organization. And also there must be appropriate and effective capacity building to equip the community with the knowledge and skills of implementing the program. From our work, we also noticed that sustainable livelihood is the most important driver for smallholders to participate in forest and landscape restoration. And therefore, for any community-based forest restoration program, it is important that there must be a livelihood project that should be implemented. And this project should provide benefits in short, medium, and long terms, and also help meet the food requirements of individual members of the community. So this project would have not been successful or would have not been possible without the support of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research and the efforts of our partners in the Philippines, including our staff of the project, the researchers from the Visayas State University, and also the relevant staff of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and of course, the members of the community organization that we are working with. Thank you.
Thank you, Nestor. We seem to be having a competition for efficient time management from the last couple of speakers. The next speaker is Bill Jackson. Bill is currently an honorary fellow at University of Sunshine Coast. He was previously Deputy Director General of IUCN, the World Conservation Union, Managing Director of Parks Victoria, and lead author of the Australian 2016 National Environmental Assessment, whatever the name of that is. State of the Environment, same thing. Yeah.
For those sins. Okay, thank you, Bob, and I will acknowledge Bob as co-author of what we're about to present here. So I'm going to talk about ecological restoration, probably more specifically forest landscape restoration, and I probably should say Southeast Asia, because the two case studies are from Southeast Asia, as you'll see in a minute. So forest landscape restoration, I put up a definition there. This is tends to be the internationally accepted definition, and David Lamb will smile now because I dug through my archives and I found 2000 July 3rd to the 5th Segovia workshop that David and I attended. I sponsored this workshop, and the definition is almost the same. We prepared that definition in 2000, so it's been around for the last 18 years. And the only and substantive and very important change is the previous definition used to say a plan process. So not long after we put out the plan process definition, we discovered that plan processes tend to be seen as top-down processes and tend to not work. So we changed it to a long-term process. We've heard from other speakers already today about the global expansion of landscape restoration, The Bond Challenge we heard about from several speakers. There's also an organisation called the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration, which has some very good material on their website. If you look at also the consultative group on international agricultural research, quite a lot of their work that's related to forests also focuses on landscape, as it does with FAO and World Bank and others. Why is the landscape approach helpful? And we've heard this also, really strong focus on it's not just about putting in trees or restoring forest, it's about restoring functionality, and that's one of the key things I'm going to pick up on in a minute. It has to be at a landscape scale, a broad enough scale that you can consider a whole range of ecosystem services. David Lamb will talk to you about that some ecosystem services do require large scales, others can be site-specific. But it also allows for negotiated trade-offs. And one of the ways we got to landscape restoration, we were trying to work out how conservation and restoration could match with poverty reduction. And the only way you can do that is if you're prepared to negotiate and trade off. And it allows for a whole range of interventions, and Nestor and others have just given us examples of the whole range of different things that happen at landscape scale. But it does require a really good data and information to make it work. So this little diagram here I put up because this is what largely happens, what forest landscape is trying to do, and often it still remains focused on tree planting, top-down planning, and not very much engagement of stakeholders. Although increasingly we're seeing it moving this way, forest landscape restoration does have a focus on ecosystem services, does have some stakeholder consultation. But the original concept was about ecosystem functionality. It was about negotiated trade-offs at a landscape scale, and it was about engaging stakeholders in an effective way. So the international work on this, there's a number of principles, I think 8 if I remember, and one of them is up there, restoring functionality of landscapes. But many FLR projects that Bob and I have looked at are not focused on restoring functionality. They're still focused on putting trees in the ground or variations of that related to agriculture and agroforestry. They are sometimes associated with ecosystem services, but they often don't adequately consider that issue of functionality. This is a diagram that I've adapted a bit. I think it's helpful in thinking through what do you mean by functionality and how does that work. So simplistically, the ecosystem produces a range or a flow of ecosystem services, provisioning services like timber, cultural services, and regulating services. And they give either benefit or cost to society. Society makes decisions or doesn't make decisions which influences the quality of those ecosystems. But largely, FLI tends to focus on what are the benefits that come out of it, or what's the flow of ecosystem services, and fairly often on biodiversity, but very rarely on things like predator-prey relationships, nutrient flows, water flows. Those things don't tend to be considered very often. Another of the 8 principles is a focus on landscapes, but in many cases it's not clear what does the landscape mean and who decides. In many cases, landscapes are socially defined, and it depends who you ask what the landscape is. For a local community, it mightn't go very far beyond their village. For a local government, it might be many, many villages. For a national level person, it might be a whole watershed. There's also different sorts of landscapes. You have social landscapes, you also have ecological landscapes such as watersheds, and there's a whole range of institutional landscapes within a landscape. There's political boundaries, administrative boundaries, private sectors have boundaries where they operate, local government boundaries and so on. And there's a number of factors, for example, floods that will intrude from outside, markets intrude from outside. So you have landscapes that extend well beyond that social and ecological structure. So you have to have this concept of progressively contextualising your landscape from a local village up to a nation state, and in some cases, particularly with markets beyond that. A third of the principles of FLR is about involving stakeholders, but our observation is how stakeholders are involved really varies immensely. And we think there's a number of questions that you need to ask yourselves when you're trying to promote ecological restoration. Whose view counts in the first place? And there's in the last 10 years, there's been quite a lot of work about pluralism, trying to get everybody's view into the same room and trying to come out with an outcome. That pluralistic approaches have a lot of problems with them, and particularly in societies that are urbanising. Australia is a very good example. I used to manage national parks in Victoria. 70% of the population of Victoria lives just in Melbourne. So who are you going to consult about park management? People that live beside the park, people that live 10 kilometres away, or people that live in Melbourne? And whose view counts with that? Who's going to pay for the trade-offs? One of the challenges of restoration and conservation is you often expect either formally or informally for the local community to give up something or to pay for the restoration. And often what they give up is part of their livelihoods. Who has the right to mediate? And particularly if you're working with government agencies, you're not neutral. You're representing a government and you have a whole range of rules and procedures that goes around you, and you're perceived by the community to have those, rightly or wrongly. And we have to ask, finally, ourselves the question, can we be relied upon as facilitators of restoration to help others articulate or pursue their vision? In some cultures, particularly Indigenous people, are quite reluctant to give out information to outsiders. Our first case study is from Sagang in Myanmar. This area, central Myanmar, quite dry. It has a very heavily dependent on forest resources and agriculture, very, very widespread deforestation and forest degradation, a lot of inequality between relatively land-rich people and relatively poor or land-less people, big challenges with land use rights. We heard in the previous session about different categories of forest. One of those categories, the unallocated forest, is a tussle between Department of Agriculture and Department of Forest about who will get the rights to that land. And the good thing about what's happening in Sagang and across all of Myanmar is the State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi mandated that Myanmar has a major national restoration program. So there's an opportunity there, and that is really driving the Forest Department to want to do something. So we designed a project there last year for the Global Environment Facility for the Forest Department, and we were very concerned that the principles I put up before, particularly ecological functionality, were not being focused on very well. So one of the things we said, first of all, you have to really understand state and trends of what we call natural capital, or including functionality. What's already happening, what's the quality and quantity, and what's the trend with those natural resources. What's the existing flow of ecosystem services, again, quality and quantity. What's coming off those degraded forests? Who benefits and who pays for that? And what's the current situation socioeconomically in terms of deficits or needs, both from a state level and a regional level and the local community level, and they're often quite different needs. And using that in a negotiated sense with the community to come up with a set of priorities for engagement. You can't do everything everywhere. So the second thing we did there was to use adaptation of an approach that Bob and I and other authors prepared on poverty and conservation, trying to look at different land functionality as it exists now and what sort of interventions you could do. And we use forest condition on one axis and opportunities for FLR on the other. For degraded forests, we found that you had to really focus on, with low forest condition and low livelihood dependencies, you could get into plantations and regeneration. If the forest was in very good condition but not high dependency, you could really just use normal approaches that government uses. If you had good forest condition and very high dependency, you tended to need to use community forestry approaches, and poor forest condition and high dependency, again community forestry, but a lot of work on agriculture. We really tried to make that focus particularly on functionality of forests, and not just about ecosystem services, but what would you need to change at a functional level in order to produce those ecosystem services. And that approach is then designed to complement that big restoration program of the government. Our second case study is in northwest Thailand. Really fascinating, this case study, in that there was an attempt by the Royal Thai Armed Forces to restore an ex-Kuomintang area. So these are people that had come from China into Myanmar or Burma at the time and then got pushed into Thailand. So they were on an area that was government land, but farming there for many generations. And the Thai Armed Forces wanted to give a present for the king and reforest it. So it was very much about tree planting and putting forest in. Of course, they didn't talk to the community very much, and the reforestation approach was unsuccessful. They then approached IUCN to get involved. How can we do this better? Interestingly, the Royal Thai Armed Forces, surprisingly, isn't the agency that's supposed to do reforestation in Thailand. That's the Royal Thai Forest Department. But if the Royal Thai Forest Department, it probably would have never entered their mind to apply a landscape approach or to do anything different than they normally would do. So the things that happened there, in particular, a multi-stakeholder platform, if you like, a form of local governance that was driven from below, but also with the involvement of the key government actors. Really important to get, as Nestor just said, that local governance working so that people have power in decision making. Really important about negotiating that outcome. Often external people come in with a land use and land capability maps and they tell people what needs to happen. But the success of landscape restoration tends to happen if you have honest negotiations with communities. And of course that negotiated outcome and trade-offs gave the community confidence that there was, they would have access to land. So it did restore forest cover and worked on erosion control. There was some promotion of native species, but there was also agroforestry and working on paddy land, which again, if it was the Royal Thai Forest Department, it was unlikely they would have a mandate or be prepared to operate on agriculture because it belongs to another government department. So the emphasis really in that case was on sustainable agricultural practices that also involved landscape level of trees. And that supported mixed farming systems, so new crops, new approaches to cropping, income generation, some market work, but already there were good markets there, and trying to address risk factors for community and over-dependency on a few products. In conclusion, Bob and I thought there's probably three observations that we have. One is that biophysical landscapes, water catchments, for example, which governments tend to operate on, almost always overlaid by multiple cultural and institutional landscapes. You need to understand how they all work if you're going to intervene. Successful land management has to be built on trade-offs. You can't achieve everything on every hectare. And such trade-offs are best balanced at a landscape scale and I'll emphasise that last two words, through a negotiated process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bill, and thanks all the speakers. We actually have about 20 minutes for questions. So I'm just going to suggest that it's supposed to be facilitated questions, but I don't quite know what that means except me asking questions or inviting people to speak. So I think if people can, nominate who you want your question to go to, keep the question as short as possible so we can get, a bit of share the questions around to the various speakers. So who wants to go first?
Actually, we have regulations for it.
Excluding the agriculture in the high biodiversity areas, the riparian and what you said?
Spring.
Spring.
Yeah.
It's probably worth mentioning that, in fact, the agriculture was promoted as a government policy. So that's the classic thing, and here you're sort of trying to recover the situation. Okay, any more questions or next one? Yes?
Two questions, if I may, to Bill. First of all, you raised the question, who has the right to mediate the negotiations and the trade-offs? Who has the right to mediate? And you raised, are we as the researchers or the external bodies viable? Well, I wondered if you had an answer to the question as well. And also, so I do a lot of work in Indonesia, and regarding you focused a lot on the trade-offs that the local communities face, and obviously that's a factor that needs to be incorporated. But a lot of the work that we've done has found that people who are really embedded within that landscape and really invested stakeholders, particularly those marginalised groups, actually feel and see that they have a lot to benefit from the restoration, that we don't have a huge fight on our hands. It's not that we're going up against it, but your large focus on the trade-offs made me wonder if the situation was very different in Myanmar in your case studies. Thank you.
Yeah, I did. They raised the question about who has the mandate to negotiate or to mediate. It has to be somebody that from the outside, that in most cases. So it's perhaps more the approach that you come with and trying to involve. In my experience, the best negotiations tend to happen when you have people from that area, local community-based organisations or NGOs that are also involved, so not just a single government agency. Where it works, where you have single agencies that do it, they tend to have to be reoriented and retrained before they're let loose with communities. And it also works reasonably well where you have a fairly risk-taking local district people that want to make something work. And I think, for those of you that involved with universities, you're very aware of the challenges of doing research in communities and making sure that you're ethically responsible. The same is not so often with people that are trying to negotiate restoration, and maybe that's a lesson for government agencies and NGOs to learn from universities about the criterion that you have to use for academic research. The issue of trade-offs, it's often not the local communities, I agree with you 100%, that are concerned about so much about restoration. It's the people that come in from outside with views about what needs to be restored or to change something. So in the Myanmar example, one of the sites that we looked at some years before, the government had built a very large dam and to build that dam they had to relocate people. So it was fantastic if you live below the dam because you suddenly got irrigated areas. If you lived above the dam, you were pushed out into very marginal forest land and then expected to make a living. So in that case, those local people, they didn't trust us very much. We weren't there that long, but they did understand that restoration would probably be a fantastic opportunity for them. Less so, government staff quite struggled a bit to see what could you do in that landscape to make it work. So, you know, I agree with you totally that local people often are very keen to do it, and opening up the eyes of particularly Forest Department or Agriculture Department to work together to find that solution from a bottom up is still a bit illusory in some cases.
I went to the conference, International ACIAR conference last year in Brazil, and the presentations that we've had today here and this morning, looking at the bond challenge and these promises that government make, millions of hectares, and then listening to some of the numbers that Danilo, you said, 600 hectares, listening to some of the issues about the problems of reaching forest restoration, land tenure, corruption, poor people without resources. I'm just not making the link in my head, even though I'm an observer working hard in Victoria, and you know, most of my time is spent during the contracting work, consulting work I do in Victoria. Somehow, my mind saying, do the politicians who make these commitments know what they're getting into, and how the hell are we going to get to 100 million hectares by 2030? Because it seems really difficult that it will be achieved. Any of you can answer this, however you like.
Is that It is a question. When you want to answer that, Danilo, I think was for us.
Yeah, well, in terms of, I think there's a huge disconnect between government commitment and the practical on-ground implementation. You know, we all know what politicians like to do. They like to make a grandiose announcement, and then the details, if any, are left to others to try and sort out. I think the targets for the international commitments to the bond challenge are silly. I don't think that there's any way that you can ever achieve those and get good outcomes. I think that one of the, and those big targets I think are actually detrimental. They've been good in terms of raising the profile of the need for restoration, but I think they're detrimental in the sense that in order to try and meet them, you've got to take a hell of a lot of shortcuts, and people are often treated as contractors in terms of planting trees in these developing countries, and that, you know, there's a long history that just simply doesn't work. So I think that you know, there are some real issues there and a real disconnect.
Does someone there want to answer that? Answer that?
I'll say a few words, and I am going to make you answer a little bit. Look, targets have a high degree of value in terms of getting political commitment and mobilising resources, whether that's financial or intellectual or human resources. So they have their value, but as John just said, they also have a lot of challenges. Can it be done technically, financially viably? All those things need to be worked through, but there is a risk there that you can marginalise local people because you push so hard to get the restoration target achieved that you just steamroll over local communities. This is déjà vu. This is exactly the issue that drove us towards landscape restoration in the first place, was we were looking at it from an issue of protected area targets. And the world was, and regions and countries like Brazil 20 years ago got really excited about achieving CBD targets. They were 10% at the time, they're higher than that now, and they were making all sorts of commitments about establishing national parks and protected areas all over the place, failed to discuss any of that with local communities. So I think that what is happening with landscape restoration, that lessons have been learned to an extent from that poor practice in the past, and particularly for international donors and the World Bank system, they have a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that we don't repeat the problems of how protected areas were established years ago, and restoration shouldn't have that problem. But notwithstanding that, there are huge challenges in meeting those really big targets, but they're already well on the way. If you look at, they've got a counter on one of their websites, and there's a huge amount of land that's already gone under restoration.
Bill, can I just make a comment on that? That what's counted in that restoration, a lot of people wouldn't actually consider it to be restoration, because I think there's several million hectares of bamboo included in at least one of those metrics. And, is that really restoration?
Could I comment there? A couple years ago, I was referring. I expressed scepticism along the lines of John's, saying that how possible was it by 2030 that we'd achieve these targets? And I had my head bitten off because a guy from somewhere who was in the inner sanctums of these organisations said, well, that doesn't mean we're going to get it done by 2030. It means we're going to make a promise to get it done by 2030. And there's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. So it's an aspirational goal. I think the idea, as I understood it, having had my head bitten off, was that they hoped that by 2030 they'd have people signing up to these aspirational goals. It might take another 100 years to do it, but at least they had the goal. Well, I've got the speaker too. I was talking to a South American restorationist who was familiar with their minister for conservation. And the minister, I think it's the 20 by 20 system in South America, isn't it? And this minister had gone to this big soiree with all his fellow ministers from various Latin American countries. And they all got fired up about this thing. And so he said, for his country, we'll put in 1 million hectares. And all his fellow ministers patted him on the back. When he got back home and he told his public servants, they were aghast. Minister, what have you done? What have you said? How are we going to do that? So I think people get carried away in international meetings and sign up for things. But the cold, hard reality comes a few days later when they get home.
Okay. Danilo, do you want to add something, or will you pass it to another question?
Just the Brazilian target is not just the international agreement, but it also represents our national legislation. So to apply the Brazilian legislation, we're going to need at least 12 million hectares to 20 million hectares. So this is actually to support the achievement of our own regulations. And then when we have these targets, also help us to get funding support. All these organizations that I described, they are getting international fund support based on these international agreements. So there's some strategies as well.
So has anyone else got questions? Maybe.
So I'm just going to make a passing comment for David. As I can't remember the name of the television show in Australia. It's a comedy about the public service and Utopia, that's it. And they always have wonderful aspirational goals, particularly building a railway line between Melbourne and Brisbane. And when the department panics about it, the minister's advisor always says they're just aspirational.
It's a bit like the carbon targets, isn't it, really?
I'm not sure about government aspirations and policy and all these grandiose plans. But I also know, having been involved in rehabilitation for many years with farmers, that when they start making money out of planting trees and bringing the soil and the land back, you don't need to push them. It just grows like wildfire. And I have had several thousands of acres converted to forest gardens just by farmers making money. So at the end of the day, if their stomachs are full and they're getting some money in hand, they will do it.
Yeah, Bill, you and Stuart McGuinness and others, and I think Bob was also involved in the very early years of FLR when you were at IUCN. When you look back now and think about what you were trying to achieve then, how do you view the current situation?
I think it probably, like many of these things, that your children become teenagers and they didn't turn out exactly as you expected. But they have a life of their own, which is great. There's elements of. I recall around about 2000 when we first started talking about landscapes. Stuart and I were in a United Nations forest meeting, and because IUCN had observer status, that I was allowed to speak after governments did, and I made a passionate speech about the need to look at landscapes and trade-offs and negotiation and all that sort of thing. And a little after that intervention, one of the representatives from a major government came up to me and said, if you clowns ever mention the word landscape in a UN meeting again, we'll have your credentials revoked. So it's gone at least from that to being fairly mainstream. I think the things that I put up were what Bob and I have worked on, our main concerns around what's happening with ecological restoration, and particularly if you're trying to portray it as a landscape approach, is failure to look at functionality, the issue of functionality, which was one of the primary things that we put in the original definition about, there's beyond biodiversity, also abiotic issues, things like trophic levels, nutrient flows, all those sort of things often are not at all considered in any place. And the other is whose view counts, and negotiated outcomes are still quite a long way to go, and how do you meaningfully engage stakeholders. So I think there's lots of great examples, but there's also a long way to go. And I think from an academic point of view, one thing that worries me is a lot of the literature that's out there talking about landscapes, if you really were critical of it, they're not landscape restoration at all. They might be inflated restoration approaches, but they're really not abiding by the principles of forest landscape restoration, and they're not considering a lot of ecological or social issues that need to do. Overall, I still think they get a B, but certainly not an A or an A plus or a fail. But I think still a way to go in many of these things. And like you, I'm also nervous about. I think targets are important, but I'm nervous about them, that they get misused and the process gets overwhelmed for speed rather than quality.
Okay, I think we'll regard that as the end of the questions, but if either Liz or Nestor want to add something, because just to round it off. Thanks.
Well, this is in regards to the question earlier about the feasibility of meeting the huge targets. I'm going to give you an example about this situation in the Philippines. The National Greening Program, the first phase, targets 1.5 million hectares. And recently, the Philippine government has been commended by FAO as one of the top 5 countries in the world that has improved its forest cover by 1.5 million hectares, which is surprisingly equivalent to the target of the National Greening Program. Many of us were surprised because, we know the realities that it's not the same thing, on the ground. So we investigated and we found out that reports from the local DNR offices shows that the target areas have been achieved. And we asked why is it that the report is like that, considering that on the ground it's not the same. And they said that if they are not going to put that report, which is 85% survival, they will not receive, the communities will not receive the billing, the payment for every hectare that is developed. So that poses a huge problem because the program seems to be very successful, but on the ground it's not saying the same thing. And in our new project, we spoke with DNR officials at the local level, suggesting that if the project can help them rehabilitate the previously planted sites, and they said no, because it has been reported as a successful project, and there's no way for them to justify to the DNR at the higher level to reforest, replant those sites again. So this is a big challenge for us, but we think our strategy would be to go straight to the national office, negotiate with them so that we can go back to those previous sites.
This is a very quick comment. I will use the opportunity to make a case for my own research. So I think that's when the indicators can be important in the Philippines, because if the metrics for success is having 85% seedling survival rate 3 years after planting, communities will be going after that, and that's what they're going to display as success. But if we have indicators that go beyond seedling survival rate, and we can have along the time different goals for that area under restoration, I think we can then achieve more significant, meaningful outcomes.
So I'd like to